September 20th, 1863. Smoke hung over the Tennessee woods like a storm that refused to move on. The air was thick with the stench of powder and pine, the ground slick with blood and torn leaves. Across the tangled ridges south of Chattanooga, the Union Army of the Cumberland was collapsing. Entire corps were breaking apart, men running for the rear, officers shouting orders that vanished into chaos. Amid the ruin, one island of blue held firm, a hilltop where one man refused to retreat. On Snodgrass Hill, Major General George Henry Thomas stood like a statue carved from granite. Shells burst around him, musket balls hissed through the smoke, but Thomas barely moved. His troops, fragments of divisions, lost regiments, men from units that no longer existed, rallied around him. They called him the Rock of Chickamauga, though no one knew that name yet. All they knew was that as long as Thomas stood, they would stand too. He ordered lines reformed, ammunition redistributed, wounded carried behind the crest. Every few minutes, another Confederate attack slammed into the hill. Longstreet's veterans from Virginia, charging again, and every time they were thrown back. For hours, the ground trembled under the weight of battle. Confederate yells rose and fell. Union volleys answered. Cannon thundered from every ridge. Officers rode back and forth through fire and confusion, rallying shattered brigades. On the right, the Union Army had ceased to exist. Rosecrans himself had been swept from the field, believing his army destroyed. But on the left, Thomas held. His calm was almost unnatural. A staff officer recalled that he seemed utterly unconscious of danger, as if carved from stone. In that steadiness, thousands of broken men found their courage again. By late afternoon, the fighting had become a kind of ritual slaughter. Ammunition was nearly gone. Men fought with bayonets and rifle butts. Brigadier General James Steedman's reserve division arrived just in time, marching double time into the fight, cheering as they came. They climbed Snodgrass Hill under fire, joined Thomas's line, and steadied it one last time. As the sun began to sink, Confederate assaults lost their rhythm. Units were too spent to continue, too scattered to coordinate. The battle that had begun in confusion was ending in exhaustion. When darkness fell, Thomas ordered a silent withdrawal. His soldiers slipped away, one brigade at a time, carrying their wounded through the Black Woods toward Rossville Gap. Behind them lay a battlefield littered with nearly 30,000 dead, and wounded the bloodiest engagement west of the Appalachians. The Confederates held the field, but the victory was hollow. They had driven the Union Army back, but not destroyed it. The Rock of Chickamauga had saved the Union's Western Army from annihilation. In the morning, the Confederates would cheer a great triumph, and the newspapers in Richmond would proclaim that the Union's grip on the West had been broken. But in truth, Chickamauga was not an ending. It was the beginning of something far greater, a siege, a reckoning, and the moment when the Union learned that salvation sometimes comes disguised as defeat. By the summer of 1863, the Union seemed to be turning the tide of war, at least on paper. Gettysburg had checked Lee in the east, and far to the south, Vicksburg had fallen on the 4th of July, splitting the Confederacy in two and giving the Union control of the Mississippi River. But behind the triumphal headlines, the situation in the Western theater was anything but secure. The Union armies had pushed deep into Tennessee, yet their hold on the heart of the Confederacy was fragile, their supply lines stretched thin across hundreds of miles of hostile country. For Abraham Lincoln, the Western theater was not just a front, it was the key to victory. The Mississippi Valley, the rail hubs of Tennessee, the mountain passes of northern Georgia, whoever controlled these controlled the spine of the South. The war, Lincoln once said, is won or lost in the West. The eastern battles might dominate the newspapers, but it was in these rough valleys and ridges that the Union's survival would be decided. At the center of it all stood Chattanooga. Perched on the Tennessee River, ringed by mountains, it was more than just a city. It was the gateway to the deep South. 3 major railroads converged there, feeding the Confederate heartland. To the Union High Command, capturing Chattanooga meant breaking the South's back, To Jefferson Davis and his generals, losing it meant the war would soon be fought on their own soil. Both sides knew it was the prize worth bleeding for. The fall of Vicksburg had created an illusion of momentum. Newspapers in the North called it the war's turning point. Lincoln's cabinet dreamed of finishing blows, a drive into Georgia, a strike at Atlanta, maybe even an end to the rebellion within a year. But Lincoln understood how fragile victory could be. The war had entered its third brutal year. Draft riots had shaken northern cities, casualty lists seemed endless, and political patience was wearing thin. The public demanded results, and quickly. Into this moment stepped Major General William S. Rosecrans, Old Rosie, to his men commanding the Union Army of the Cumberland. A brilliant organizer and strategist, Rosecrans had driven Confederate forces from Middle Tennessee in a nearly bloodless campaign, earning praise from Lincoln himself. Now he stood poised to finish the job, drive Braxton Bragg's army out of Tennessee entirely, and seize Chattanooga. Success would cement the Union's hold on the West. Failure might undo everything Vicksburg had gained. The stakes were enormous, and everyone knew it. The next battle in the West wouldn't just decide a city, it would decide whether the Union could sustain its momentum or whether the Confederacy could claw back from disaster. In the summer heat of 1863, as armies maneuvered through the mountains of Tennessee and northern Georgia, the war's center of gravity quietly shifted. The Western theater was no longer secondary, it was the war. In the late summer of 1863, the war in the West was defined as much by its commanders as by its geography. On one side stood Major General William Starker Rosecrans, commanding the Union Army of the Cumberland, a man of sharp intellect, deep faith, and a mind that worked faster than most could follow. He was an engineer by training, a thinker who believed wars were won with brains as much as blood. His troops loved him for his care and energy. His superiors feared his temper and his pride. To many, Rosecrans seemed on the verge of greatness or disaster. He was a man of contradictions, brilliant but volatile, devout yet impulsive. Rosecrans could plan a campaign with mathematical precision, then erupt in anger at a subordinate over a misplaced report. His tent overflowed with sketches, charts, and correspondence. He slept little, talked fast, and saw patterns others missed. After his stunning Tullahoma campaign, he had become the Western hero. Lincoln needed the general who could outthink his enemies instead of merely outfight them. Yet his very intelligence bred a dangerous confidence. He believed Bragg's army was broken, and that belief would soon lead him straight into a trap. Facing him across the mountains was General Braxton Bragg, commander of the Confederate Army of Tennessee. A man as dour and embattled as Rosecrans was energetic. A West Point graduate and veteran of the Mexican War, Bragg was respected for his discipline and professionalism. But he was also reviled by his own officers, who whispered that he was stubborn, arrogant, and impossible to serve under. His army obeyed him, but few loved him. In camp, his soldiers joked that Bragg's greatest enemy wasn't the Yankees, it was his own staff. Bragg's army was a wounded force, brave, battle-hardened, but divided. After their retreat from Middle Tennessee, morale had plummeted. Officers quarreled openly, generals questioned orders, and rumors of replacement swirled through headquarters. Yet Bragg still possessed dangerous assets: veteran infantry, fierce cavalry under Forrest and Wheeler, and the advantage of fighting on familiar ground. If he could strike before Rosecrans's dispersed army reassembled, he might turn defeat into redemption. The two commanders were opposites in almost every sense. Rosecrans inspired affection, Bragg inspired obedience. Rosecrans led by persuasion, Bragg by punishment. The Union general was imaginative, often too much so. The Confederate was rigid, often to his own detriment, and yet both men carried the same burden, the knowledge that their army's fate, and perhaps the fate of the entire Western War, rested on their shoulders. As their forces converged through the hills of northern Georgia, each man was haunted by a different ghost. Rosecrans feared hesitation, that he might let opportunity slip away. Bragg feared betrayal, that his subordinates would fail him again. Between these two flawed commanders, The stage was set for a battle that would reveal both genius and ruin, courage and chaos, and would test not just armies, but the very souls of the men who led them. In the summer of 1863, the rains came to Tennessee, endless grey days that turned roads into rivers and fields into swamps. While Lee and Meade were marching toward Gettysburg, William Rosecrans was orchestrating something quieter but no less brilliant, a campaign of movement, deception, and nerve. The Tullahoma campaign would never capture the public imagination. There were no grand battles, no glorious charges, but it would become one of the most perfectly executed operations of the entire war. Braxton Bragg held a strong defensive line across Middle Tennessee, anchored on the Duck River and the ridges near Tullahoma. His army, battered from earlier defeats, sat behind earthworks and entrenchments, confident that the weather and the terrain would keep the Yankees at bay. Rosecrans looked at that same muddy landscape and saw opportunity. Instead of attacking head-on, he would outthink Bragg, force him out of his fortifications without a major battle, and do it all while keeping his army intact. It was a chess player's plan, not a gambler's. Rosecrans divided his forces and sent them feinting in multiple directions, convincing Bragg that a frontal assault was coming, while his real thrust struck at the Confederate flank. He pushed columns through roads that seemed impassable, marching in sheets of rain, hauling artillery through mud up to the axles. His supply trains slogged forward mile by mile, yet the army moved with precision and discipline. Every time Bragg shifted to meet one threat, Rosecrans was already behind him, threatening his line of retreat. The Confederate general, fearing encirclement, abandoned one position after another. By the 1st of July, the Army of the Cumberland had driven Bragg's forces out of Middle Tennessee entirely. In 10 days of maneuver, Rosecrans had captured more territory than many generals managed in a year, and he'd done it with fewer than 600 casualties. The Confederate army, demoralized and drenched, fell back toward Chattanooga, its hold on Tennessee shattered. Even the weather seemed to bow to Rosecrans's will. Lincoln, reading the reports in Washington, could hardly believe it. "The flanking of Bragg," he wrote, "is the most splendid piece of strategy I know of. But triumph carries its own danger. The very ease of Rosecrans's victory planted a quiet arrogance in his mind. He began to believe that Bragg's army could never stand against him again, that another quick series of maneuvers could drive the Confederates clean out of the South. His confidence grew into impatience. His correspondence with Washington became sharp, even dismissive. He felt underappreciated, certain that he saw the war more clearly than anyone else, even his president. In truth, Rosecrans had beaten not just Bragg but luck itself. The weather, the timing, the missteps of his enemy all had combined in his favor. Yet instead of caution, success taught him certainty. As his army settled into camp and the rains finally ceased, Rosecrans began planning the next move, a push toward Chattanooga. He believed it would be another Tullahoma, swift, bloodless, inevitable. He had no idea that the campaign ahead would lead him straight into the dark woods of Chickamauga and into the deadliest battle the Western armies would ever fight. By late August of 1863, the Army of the Cumberland was on the move again, 60,000 men threading their way through the wilderness of southern Tennessee and northern Alabama. Their goal was the prize that had eluded every Union army before them: Chattanooga, the gateway to the Deep South. Nestled between the Tennessee River and a wall of mountains, it was a fortress city guarded by steep ridges and narrow passes. To take it would open the road to Georgia and the heart of the Confederacy. To lose it would mean another year of stalemate. Rosecrans knew Bragg expected him to attack from the north, along the direct road from Tullahoma. So, as at Tullahoma, he chose deception. His army fanned out over 100 miles, marching through rough country that few thought passable. Columns crossed mountain ridges, dragging cannon by hand up rocky slopes. Cavalry scouted ahead, cutting telegraph lines and seizing bridges. Supply wagons groaned along trails so narrow that mules had to be unhitched and led one by one. It was a logistical miracle and an act of breathtaking audacity. The key was the Tennessee River. Broad, winding, and treacherous, It marked the final barrier between Rosecrans and Chattanooga. Under his direction, engineers built makeshift pontoons, lashed rafts from flatboats and barrels, and shuttled entire divisions across under cover of darkness. At Stevenson and Bridgeport, troops worked waist-deep in the current, guided by torchlight. When dawn broke, the blue columns were already on the far bank, their presence undetected. To Bragg, still peering northward, it seemed impossible. The Union army had vanished and then reappeared behind him. Rosecrans's plan was working perfectly. By crossing below Chattanooga, he threatened Bragg's rear and his vital railroad to Atlanta. The Confederate general, fearing encirclement, abandoned the city without a fight, retreating into the hills of northern Georgia. It was another triumph of maneuver, another brilliant stroke of mind over muscle. Union troops marched proudly through Chattanooga's empty streets on September 9th, raising the stars and stripes above the city at last. The road to Georgia lay open. But the very brilliance of the maneuver hid its fatal weakness. In order to execute such a wide flanking movement, Rosecrans had scattered his army across rugged terrain. His corps were separated by mountains and rivers. Their lines of communication stretched to the breaking point. Supply trains lagged behind, the telegraph wires were down, and coordination depended on couriers who took days to ride from one headquarters to another. The army that had moved with clockwork precision at Tullahoma was now a collection of isolated columns groping their way through hostile country. Rosecrans didn't see it or refused to. He believed Bragg was beaten, retreating in panic toward Atlanta. He pressed forward recklessly, convinced that one more push would destroy the Confederate army for good. In truth, Bragg had only fallen back to regroup. He was gathering reinforcements, planning a counterstrike, and waiting for the moment when Rosecrans's bold advance would stretch just a little too far. The trap was already forming, hidden in the folds of the Georgia hills. When Braxton Bragg reached the hills of northern Georgia in early September of 1863, his army was angry, exhausted, and divided. The retreat from Chattanooga, another in a long series of withdrawals, had pushed morale to the breaking point. Soldiers muttered openly that they were tired of marching backward, tired of their general's endless caution. Even Bragg's officers had begun to lose faith. His army was still dangerous, but it was also fracturing from within. Bragg's headquarters at Lafayette became a boiling cauldron of discontent. His corps commanders, men like Leonidas Polk and D.H. Hill, held private meetings where they criticized his leadership and plotted ways to have him removed. Polk, the former Episcopal bishop turned soldier, styled himself Bragg's equal in all but title and often acted like it. Hill, a hard-bitten North Carolinian, despised Bragg's temper and questioned his judgment at every turn. Behind their polished courtesy, these men waged a quiet war of insubordination. Bragg knew it. He could sense the disloyalty around him like a change in the weather. His dispatches grew sharper, his tone more defensive. He wrote to Richmond demanding clarity: either he had authority to command or he did not. "My subordinates," he warned, "are more dangerous to me than the enemy." Yet, amid this turmoil, Bragg's mind remained focused on one clear objective: to strike Rosecrans before the scattered Union Corps could reunite. For all his faults, he saw the opportunity that others missed. From his scouts and cavalry reports, Bragg realized that Rosecrans had dangerously overextended his lines in the mountains south of Chattanooga. The Union army was stretched across 50 miles of rough country, its columns separated by ridges and poor roads. If Bragg could move fast, he might fall upon one isolated corps, crush it, and then turn on the next before the Federals could react. It was the same strategy Napoleon had used to destroy armies larger than his own, to beat them in pieces. In early September, Bragg called his commanders to a council of war. Around the table, tempers flared. Polk argued for caution, claiming the men were too exhausted to attack. Hill wanted clearer intelligence before risking a move. Bragg listened in silence, then slammed his fist on the map. "Gentlemen," he said, "the enemy is in our grasp. We strike now, or we abandon the campaign entirely." The room fell silent. Even his critics knew he was right. Orders went out that night. The Army of Tennessee would advance north from Lafayette at dawn, converging on the mountain passes around Dug Gap and McLemore's Cove. There, Bragg intended to trap one of Rosecrans's corps, an entire wing of the Union Army, and annihilate it before the others could intervene. After months of retreat, the Confederate Army was finally turning to fight. The men cheered when the bugles sounded the next morning, unaware that the same divisions tearing their leaders apart would soon tear their victory away. At dawn on September 11th, 1863, Braxton Bragg had his first real chance to destroy a Union army in the field. His plan was sound. One of Rosecrans's corps, George Thomas's lead division under James Negley, had marched blindly into McLemore's Cove, a narrow valley hemmed in by steep ridges and forested slopes. Confederate forces under D.H. Hill and Leonidas Polk were perfectly positioned to close both ends of the trap. For once, the Yankees had walked straight into Bragg's hands. All he needed was swift obedience. The valley itself was a death cage, the single road wound between Missionary Ridge and Pigeon Mountain like a noose tightening around the Federals. Bragg's scouts reported that Negley's force was isolated, barely 5,000 men with no immediate support. If Hill attacked from the east and Polk from the west, the Union division would be crushed before Rosecrans even knew what had happened. Bragg's staff drew up the orders at once. The attack would begin at dawn. But dawn came, and nothing happened. D.H. Hill, claiming confusion about the orders, hesitated. He demanded confirmation, then reinforcements, then more time. His troops remained idle while Negley's soldiers dug in. On the western ridge, Polk was supposed to strike simultaneously. He didn't. He sent word that his columns were not yet in position, and suggested waiting for Hill. The morning slipped away, then the afternoon. Inside McLemore's Cove, Negley could hardly believe his luck. He ordered an immediate withdrawal, his men dragging artillery back through the muddy road while Confederate skirmishers watched from the ridges above and still did not move. When Bragg learned that his generals had let the opportunity vanish, he was incandescent with fury. "Had my orders been obeyed," he raged, "we should have crushed the enemy utterly." But his army was already falling back into its old habits of paralysis and distrust. Hill blamed Polk. Polk blamed Hill. Both blamed Bragg. What should have been a decisive victory became another exercise in frustration. The Union division escaped intact, and with it went Bragg's only clear chance to defeat Rosecrans before the armies fully joined. For the soldiers who trudged away from the cove that evening, the failure was more than tactical, it was psychological. They had been promised redemption after months of retreat, a chance to strike back. Instead, they watched the enemy march away unscathed. "We could hear their wagons rattling all night," one Confederate wrote bitterly, "and we did nothing." Bragg's authority, already fragile, crumbled further. His generals now mocked him openly, while he seethed with resentment and suspicion. Yet the larger campaign rolled on. Rosecrans still believed Bragg was in full retreat, never realizing how narrowly his army had escaped disaster. And Bragg, humiliated but undeterred, began looking for another opportunity to strike. The mountains of North Georgia still hid his enemy, still offered the promise of ambush. He would not waste the next one, or so he told himself. But McLemore's Cove had exposed something deeper than bad timing. It revealed an army whose greatest enemy was not the Union, but itself. By mid-September of 1863, William Rosecrans believed he was on the verge of ending the war in the West. Bragg's army, he thought, was broken and fleeing deeper into Georgia. Reports from scouts seemed to confirm it: empty camps, burned bridges, and abandoned supply wagons. The Confederate retreat looked genuine, and Rosecrans, flush from his earlier triumphs, decided to pursue. His army fanned out through the mountains of North Georgia in a wide arc, each corps marching on separate roads, separated by miles of ridges and rivers. It was a bold maneuver and a disastrous one. The land itself conspired against him. Northern Georgia was a maze of narrow valleys, dense woods, and twisting mountain trails that turned into gullies after rain. Maps were vague or flatly wrong. Roads that looked close on paper were divided by steep ravines or impassable slopes. Messages that should have taken hours required days to travel by courier. Rosecrans's headquarters at Crawfish Springs could no longer communicate effectively with all his corps. The army that had moved like clockwork through Tennessee was now scattered and half-blind in hostile country. To the west, George Thomas's corps was stalled in the mountain passes. To the east, Alexander McCook and Thomas Crittenden were spread out along distant roads, convinced the Confederates were still retreating. In reality, Bragg was doing nothing of the kind. He was regrouping south of the Lafayette-Chickamauga line, pulling in reinforcements and preparing to strike. His scouts shadowed every Union column, noting their isolation and the growing gaps between them. The hunter was about to become the hunted. Yet Rosecrans refused to believe it. His correspondence from this period reads like the notes of a man chasing shadows. "Bragg is retreating in disorder," he wrote to Washington. "We must press him while he runs." He drove his army onward, urging his subordinates to close in and cut off his line of retreat. Officers on the ground, seeing signs of fresh Confederate camps, began to suspect otherwise, but their warnings went unheeded. Rosecrans's mind was fixed on a victory narrative, the final pursuit that would drive the enemy out of the mountains and perhaps end the campaign in one decisive blow. The irony was cruel. Every mile the Union columns advanced brought them deeper into the jaws of Bragg's army. The long ridgelines that split them apart would make mutual support nearly impossible once the fighting began. A sudden Confederate strike could crush one corps before the others even heard the gunfire. Still, the Federals pressed on, dust rising from their long blue columns under the Georgia Sunday. To their commander, it was the march of triumph. To history, it would be remembered as the march into a trap. On September 18th, Bragg began to move north, his divisions crossing the Chickamauga Creek, the River of Death, as the Cherokee called it, intent on cutting off Rosecrans from Chattanooga. The Union army, strung out and unaware, was walking straight toward him. Within 48 hours, both sides would collide in a tangle of forest and fog. The illusion of victory was about to end in thunder. In the first days of September 1863, the Confederate capital in Richmond was gripped by anxiety. Lee's army had fallen back from Pennsylvania, Vicksburg was lost, and Braxton Bragg, the only major Confederate commander still holding a line in the West, was in retreat from Chattanooga. Jefferson Davis knew the stakes. If Chattanooga fell for good, the Union would split the Confederacy again, this time along its heart. In desperation, he made a bold and costly decision: to strip troops from Robert E. Lee's army in Virginia and send them halfway across the South to save Bragg. The man chosen to lead this lifeline was Lieutenant General James Longstreet, Lee's most trusted corps commander, the stalwart of the Army of Northern Virginia. His veterans, hardened by years of war from the Peninsula to Gettysburg, were among the finest troops in either army. Davis ordered Longstreet to take 2 divisions, nearly 12,000 men, and move them to Bragg's aid with all speed. It was the Confederacy's first great attempt at long-distance military reinforcement, and it would test the limits of its railroads, its logistics, and its luck. From the camps near Orange Court House, the grey columns began their journey west. They marched to stations along the Virginia Central Railroad, boarding trains that rattled and groaned through the Blue Ridge, across the mountains of East Tennessee, and down toward the battlefields of Georgia. The route was a patchwork of mismatched gauges and broken lines. At each junction, men had to unload, march to another depot, and reload onto a different set of cars. Artillery pieces were disassembled and reassembled. Horses were left behind for lack of transport. What should have been a week-long trip became a grinding odyssey of more than 800 miles. Through it all, Southern civilians lined the tracks, waving handkerchiefs and cheering as the trains passed. Newspapers called them Lee's veterans riding to save the West. The soldiers, weary but proud, sang as the trains clattered past small towns and fields, their voices echoing into the night. Yet the cost of this gamble was enormous. Every man sent west was one less defending Richmond. Lee himself protested, warning that the move weakened his army dangerously. But Davis pressed on. Chickamauga, he believed, could not be lost. By September 18th, the first of Longstreet's troops reached Bragg's army near Lafayette. They arrived in fragments regiments at a time, their wagons and horses still strung out along hundreds of miles of rail, but their presence lifted morale instantly. These were the men who had fought beside Lee, who had broken Union lines at 2nd Manassas and Fredericksburg. The Western soldiers greeted them with awe, convinced that their arrival meant victory was certain. On paper, the reinforcement changed everything. Bragg now commanded nearly 70,000 men, a force larger than Rosecrans's divided army. For the first time in months, the Confederates held the advantage. But in reality, the cracks in Bragg's command remained. His generals still feuded. His plans were still misunderstood. Longstreet's veterans had come to fight, but they were stepping into an army already poisoned by distrust. Their arrival would tip the scales of battle, but not in the way anyone in Richmond imagined. The battlefield of Chickamauga was a wilderness, not an open field of glory, but a maze of pine, oak, and tangled underbrush where visibility rarely stretched beyond 50 yards. To the soldiers who marched into it in September of 1863, it felt less like a battleground than a trap. The ground rolled and folded in uneven ridges, crossed by a crooked stream whose Cherokee name, Chickamauga, meant River of Death. In the humid air of northern Georgia, it lived up to the name. The creek itself wound through a narrow valley running north to south, its banks thick with briar and alder. On either side rose low ridges, Missionary Ridge to the west, Pigeon Mountain to the east, and between them sprawled a labyrinth of woods broken by a handful of open clearings. These meadows, modest in size but crucial in the coming fight, bore names that would soon become etched in blood: Brotherton, Vineyard, Kelly, and Dyer. They were islands of light in a sea of shadow, places where the smoke could lift just enough for cannon fire to find its mark. But most of Chickamauga was blind. Units advancing even a few dozen yards lost sight of their flanks. Regiments vanished into the trees, emerging miles from where they were supposed to be. Orders that seemed simple on a map became impossible once the shooting started. Commanders could hear the battle, but rarely see it. In those thickets, the crack of muskets came from every direction at once, and soldiers fired at the movement of branches or the flash of a bayonet. The maps the generals carried were worse than useless. Drawn from outdated surveys, they showed roads that no longer existed, and fields that had long since turned back to forest. There were no clear landmarks, only fences, farmhouses, and wagon paths that twisted through the timber. Staff officers sent to deliver messages often got lost, stumbling into enemy lines or wandering for hours before finding their own. The confusion would become so great that entire brigades fired into friendly troops, mistaking blue for grey and grey for blue. In this dense, smoky wilderness, the usual rules of warfare collapsed. Artillery was nearly useless, its gunners unable to find targets or clear fields of fire, cavalry, deprived of open ground, dismounted and fought on foot. Battles that elsewhere would have been fought by brigades became dozens of isolated firefights, each raging in its own pocket of forest. The generals could issue orders, but once the fighting began, the soldiers were on their own. Chickamauga's terrain favored no one, it punished everyone. The dense woods swallowed sound, turned lines into knots, and erased the boundaries between courage and chaos. Men fought not for position or strategy, but for survival, often unsure whether they were winning or losing. It was a battlefield that defied control, where skill and valor mattered less than sheer endurance. And it was on this ground, amid the thickets and the fog, that the fate of the Union's Western Army would soon be decided. At dawn on September 19, 1863, the fog rose thick and white over the woods of northern Georgia. Along the crooked line of Chickamauga Creek, both armies were groping in the dark, neither expecting a full-scale battle, both about to blunder into one. Pickets on both sides exchanged scattered shots at Reed's Bridge, where Confederate cavalry under Nathan Bedford Forrest tested the Union flank. By 7 o'clock, the skirmish had swelled into something far greater. The Battle of Chickamauga had begun not by plan, but by accident. The early fighting was chaotic and brutal. Forrest's troopers, dismounted and fighting like infantry, pressed across the creek against Union brigades that had been sent merely to scout. Reinforcements poured in on both sides, each commander convinced he was facing only a probing force. Within hours, what had begun as a skirmish became a grinding contest across the thickets and ridges east of the Lafayette Road. Companies collided without orders. Regiments advanced, fired, and fell back, often unaware of who stood beside them. The woods swallowed formations whole. For Rosecrans, the confusion was maddening. Reports arrived piecemeal, each contradicting the last. One messenger swore Bragg was attacking in force. Another claimed the enemy was retreating. Rosecrans, convinced this was only a rear-guard action, fed his divisions into the fight one at a time, instead of massing them for a decisive blow. On the Confederate side, Bragg did much the same, sending in brigades as they arrived, scattered across miles of broken country. The result was not a battle line, but a patchwork of local fights, savage, directionless, and costly. By mid-morning, the struggle centered on the fields of Vineyard and Brotherton. Union and Confederate troops fought back and forth through the corn and timber, the line changing hands half a dozen times before noon. Each charge was met with a countercharge, each gain was paid for in blood. Artillery thundered blindly into the smoke, felling friend and foe alike. It was like fighting in a nightmare, one Union soldier wrote later, the air full of screaming lead and no front or rear to it. Through this chaos, one calm presence began to emerge: Major General George H. Thomas. Commanding the Union left, Thomas grasped the situation more clearly than anyone else. While Rosecrans tried to piece together the reports, Thomas was already shifting brigades, reinforcing threatened gaps, and organizing a defense that held when everything else seemed to unravel. His men fought fiercely around Kelly Field, repelling repeated Confederate attacks and preventing Bragg from turning the Union flank. By afternoon, Pap Thomas, as his soldiers called him, had become the anchor of the army. As night fell, neither side could claim victory. The Confederates had gained ground but failed to break the Union line. The Federals had held, but at a staggering cost. More than 16,000 men lay dead or wounded across the woods, and Field's casualties piled high for no decisive result. Exhausted soldiers slept where they fell, the cries of the wounded echoing through the darkness. The Battle of Chickamauga had found itself, and both armies knew it was far from over. Tomorrow, the real test would come. Night came down over Chickamauga like a shroud. The forest still smoked from the day's gunfire, and the cries of the wounded drifted through the trees, a low, unending moan that neither side could silence. The two armies lay only a few hundred yards apart, separated by darkness and exhaustion. Thousands of men were lost in the woods, too weak to move, calling out for water that never came. Lanterns flickered among the trees as stretcher-bearers searched for the living, often stumbling over the dead. The night of September 19th, 1863, was not quiet. It was haunted. For the Union soldiers, it was a night of confusion and fear. Units had fought all day without knowing where their comrades stood. Now they dug in along ridges and fields, unsure who was to their left or right. Ammunition was running low. Many regiments had fired off their last cartridges by sunset, and supply wagons were still miles to the rear. In some companies, men scrounged rounds from the cartridge boxes of the fallen, wiping the blood from their hands as they reloaded. No one knew whether they would be attacked again before dawn. At Rosecrans's headquarters near Crawfish Springs, the situation was barely clearer. Reports arrived in fragments, some optimistic, others dire. The general himself was gaunt from sleeplessness, his eyes bloodshot as he pored over maps that bore little resemblance to the tangled battlefield outside. He believed Bragg was trying to retreat toward Rome, Georgia, and that the day's fighting had merely been a rearguard action. In truth, the entire Confederate army lay massed just across the creek, ready to strike. Bragg, for his part, saw the day's fighting as a prelude, not an end. He was convinced that Rosecrans had thrown his entire army into the fray and that the Union line was wavering. Around midnight, under a moon half hidden by clouds, he gathered his commanders and issued his orders. The attack would be renewed at dawn. Polk's corps would strike the Union left at first light, Hill's would follow on the right, and Longstreet, whose men were still arriving from Virginia, would hit the center once the lines engaged. It was a sound plan on paper, coordinated, overwhelming, decisive. But the army that was meant to execute it was anything but coordinated. Polk received the written order late, and his staff misplaced it. Hill claimed he never saw his copy at all. Longstreet's divisions were scattered along the roads, half of them still marching through the night. By sunrise, Bragg's plan to strike at dawn would already be unraveling. In the Union camps, officers tried to restore order. George Thomas, calm as ever, moved among his troops by lantern light, realigning brigades and whispering encouragement. "We will stand tomorrow," he said simply. His soldiers believed him. They tightened their belts, stacked what ammunition they had, and waited. In the dark woods between the two armies, fireflies blinked among the bodies, and the sound of axes echoed faintly as both sides built hasty breastworks. The stage was set for the storm to break. The morning of September 20th, 1863, dawned with a heavy mist clinging to the woods. It muffled sound, blurred the horizon, and hid the two armies crouched barely a musket shot apart. For Braxton Bragg, this was supposed to be the hour of redemption. His orders were clear. At first light, the Confederate line would advance in unison and crush the Union army once and for all. But dawn came, and nothing moved. His subordinates were still tangled in confusion, their units misaligned, their orders misunderstood. The grand assault that was to begin at sunrise sputtered into fragments before it ever began. When the first Confederate attack finally came, it fell on the Union left the sector under George H. Thomas. Bragg's troops surged out of the woods around Jay's Mill and Kelly Field, yelling the rebel cry, their bayonets glinting in the mist. Thomas's men were ready. They met the assault with controlled volleys, muskets cracking in deadly rhythm. Line after line of grey swept forward and were thrown back. The ground changed hands 3 times in the first 2 hours, but Thomas held, calmly shifting regiments to meet each new threat. His steadiness radiated through the ranks. Wherever he rode, the line seemed to stiffen. "Old Pap will hold," the soldiers murmured. To the south, the Union center and right were less fortunate. Rosecrans, still convinced that Bragg's main blow would fall on his left, began to shuffle divisions northward to reinforce Thomas. Each movement left a gap that had to be filled by another, like an endless sliding puzzle. Headquarters was chaos couriers galloping in with conflicting messages, maps spread across tables that bore no resemblance to the real terrain. Rosecrans's temper flared as reports poured in faster than he could process them. Somewhere along the line, someone shouted that a gap had opened between 2 divisions. Rosecrans, fearing disaster, ordered an immediate correction. The order, hurriedly written and poorly understood, was sent to Brigadier General Thomas J. Wood, close up on Reynolds and support him. But Reynolds was not where Rosecrans thought he was, and Wood's movement, meant to seal a non-existent hole, would soon create a very real one. Even as the couriers sped off, Thomas continued to repel attack after attack on the Union left. His soldiers fought behind makeshift breastworks of logs and rails, their faces blackened with powder, their ranks thinning with every volley. Yet the line still held, anchored on sheer determination. By 10 o'clock, Bragg's assaults had failed to break through. His troops, bleeding and disordered, fell back to regroup. The morning belonged to Thomas, but in the center, the Union army was beginning to unravel. Miscommunication had set a deadly trap in motion, one that neither Rosecrans nor his staff yet understood. As the mist burned away and the sun climbed higher, the field fell eerily quiet. The lull before the storm had come, and the storm was about to break with a fury none of them could imagine. At 10:30 on the morning of September 20th, 1863, a single order changed the course of the battle and nearly the war itself. In the heat and confusion of the fight, William Rosecrans received word that a gap had opened in his line somewhere near the center. Whether the report came from a confused courier or a misread map is still debated, but what mattered was his reaction. Convinced that his flank was exposed, he dictated a hurried order to Brigadier General Thomas J. Wood, close up on Reynolds and support him. It seemed simple enough. In the chaos of Chickamauga, it was fatal. Wood, a capable and obedient officer, had already endured Rosecrans's temper earlier that morning for hesitating on a previous command. Now, determined not to be accused of disobedience again, he carried out the order to the letter, even though he knew it made no sense. His division was part of the solid Union line near the Brotherton farm, facing south, with no actual gap to his left. To close up on Reynolds, as written, meant pulling his men out of position and marching them behind the line to another sector, effectively creating the very hole Rosecrans feared. Wood glanced once more toward the enemy, then gave the order, "Forward, march." Kamer is weakened a loftadize, created loftadile rammer. The blue columns filed off through the woods, their place in the line momentarily unguarded. No one could have chosen a worse moment. Across the field, hidden by the trees and the morning haze, James Longstreet's fresh corps, veterans of Lee's army, newly arrived from Virginia, were forming for a massive assault. Longstreet had spent the morning studying the terrain, searching for the weakest point in the Union line. He had found it, the Brotherton sector. He was about to hit it with the full weight of his attack column. At precisely the moment Wood's men cleared the gap, Longstreet's troops surged forward. 8,000 Confederate infantry poured out of the trees in dense, unstoppable waves. The timing was so perfect it seemed preordained. They smashed directly into the open seam, driving deep into the Union center before anyone realized what had happened. Artillery limbers overturned, supply wagons scattered, and entire divisions were caught from the flank and rear. The air filled with the deafening roar of musket fire and the thunder of rebel yells. Rosecrans, riding nearby, saw the disaster unfold and froze. He tried to rally the retreating troops, shouting for order, but the tide was already breaking. One aide wrote that the army melted like snow in the Sunday. Within minutes, the Union center collapsed completely. Regiments that had fought bravely all morning now streamed toward the rear, colliding with wagons and ambulances in a desperate rush for safety. Rosecrans himself was swept up in the rout, nearly captured, and eventually driven from the field altogether. Behind him, the Confederates poured through the gap, their momentum carrying them deep into the Union rear. The battlefield erupted in chaos. What had been a precarious balance was now a rout in the making. And all of it, the collapse, the panic, the near destruction of an entire army, had begun with one misunderstood order and a general who tried to obey it too precisely. At the Brotherton farm, the war's cruelest coincidence had found its mark. The breakthrough at Brotherton hit the Union army like a cannon blast to the heart. One moment, the line stood firm amid the smoke. The next, it disintegrated. Longstreet's grey columns, packed shoulder to shoulder, drove straight through the gap with the force of a hammer blow. Bayonets flashed, muskets roared, and within minutes the Union center was split wide open. Soldiers who had held all morning now found enemies pouring into their flanks and rear. The cry of, "We're flanked! We're flanked!" rippled down the line, and panic followed. Rosecrans galloped toward the sound of the collapse, his staff scattering around him. Dust and smoke hid everything until he reached the ridge above Dyer Field and saw what no commander ever wishes to see: his army coming apart before his eyes. Divisions were breaking into fragments, batteries' limbers overturned in flight, wagons jammed on the narrow roads. Officers shouted, tried to rally men, but the current was too strong. Once panic takes hold in battle, it moves faster than any general can think. Longstreet rode at the head of his assault, calm and methodical even as the field erupted in chaos. His men swept forward in waves, driving Union brigades before them like leaves in a gale. They captured batteries, seized wagons, and rolled up the line north and south. For a moment, it seemed the entire army of the Cumberland might be annihilated. "We've got them!" Longstreet shouted, urging his troops onward, and for the Confederates who surged through that widening hole, it looked like victory absolute and total. Rosecrans, caught in the maelstrom, narrowly escaped capture. His staff officers begged him to fall back before the enemy cut him off entirely. Reluctantly, stunned and heartsick, he turned his horse toward Chattanooga. Behind him, his army was dissolving. Major General Crittenden's and McCook's corps were in full retreat, streaming west in confusion, their banners lost, their guns abandoned. They would not stop for hours. By early afternoon, what had been half the Union Army simply ceased to exist as a fighting force. Yet the battlefield was not entirely lost. Amid the flood of fugitives, pockets of blue still held their ground, scattered brigades under generals like John Brannan, James Steedman, and George Thomas. They gathered on the ridges near Snodgrass Hill, forming impromptu strongpoints from shattered divisions. These fragments of order stood against the tide, buying time as the rest of the army fell away. The men who stayed did so not because of orders, but because instinct told them someone had to stand. By 2 o'clock, Longstreet's assault had run its course, spent from victory. The Confederates held the center of the field, but their line had stretched thin. On the Union left, Thomas's steady hand was already shaping a new defense. The day's disaster was complete but not final. The Union Army had been broken. Its commander swept from the field, yet, in the chaos, a rock was forming amid the flood. Before nightfall, that rock would stop the Confederate tide. By mid-afternoon on September 20th, 1863, what was left of the Union Army had fallen back to the wooded ridge around Snodgrass Hill. Smoke clung to the trees, the air heavy with the smell of powder and pine sap. George H. Thomas sat his horse near the crest, face calm, eyes steady. His army was broken, his commander gone, but retreat was not in him. "We will hold this ground," he said quietly. The men around him believed it because they had no choice not to. As Confederate forces poured forward, Thomas gathered the remnants' shattered brigades, wandering detachments, even cooks and teamsters who had picked up rifles. He threw them into line along the ridge, anchoring his flanks on the wooded slopes. Every few minutes, more men arrived from the chaos below, breathless, filthy, and ready to fight again. When the first grey wave struck, the line bent but did not break. The volleys came point blank, the smoke so thick it seemed to rain fire. Thomas rode the ridge calmly, giving orders in a voice that never rose above normal conversation. Below him, on the rear slopes, new help was arriving. Brigadier General James Steedman's reserve division, nearly 5,000 men from the Army of the Ohio, had been marching toward the sound of battle since noon. Without waiting for orders, Steedman and his superior, General Gordon Granger, had decided on their own to move toward the firing. When they reached Snodgrass Hill, they found Thomas still holding but bleeding badly. Without hesitation, Steedman shouted, "Forward, boys, up the hill," and led his men straight into the fight. The Confederates struck again and again, sometimes climbing within yards of the Union guns before being hurled back. Ammunition ran low. Soldiers passed cartridges hand to hand along the line, and when the boxes ran dry, they scavenged from the dead. In some regiments, the wounded lay behind the ranks, loading rifles for those still firing. Granger's men counterattacked with the bayonet, retaking ground already slick with blood. It was not battle, one survivor wrote later. It was simply endurance. Hour after hour the attacks came, from Longstreet's corps on the right and from fresh divisions fed into the fight. The sun sank behind the hills, turning the smoke gold, but the thunder never stopped. Thomas refused to yield. His horse was shot from under him. He borrowed another and kept riding. Aides begged him to retreat before the army was surrounded. "One more charge, and we'll withdraw," he replied, and he said it again, and again, until at last, As darkness fell, he gave the word. In the fading light, Thomas's soldiers disengaged with the precision of a parade drill. Brigade by brigade, they slipped back through the trees toward Rossville Gap, carrying their wounded and guns with them. The Confederates, too spent to pursue, halted on the blood-soaked ridge. When the last Union soldier stepped off Snodgrass Hill, the field fell silent for the first time in 2 days. Behind them lay a field littered with 24,000 casualties. Before them, the road to Chattanooga and survival. The Confederates would claim victory, and rightly so. They held the ground. But in the long view of history, it was Thomas's stand that mattered most. His unyielding defense saved the Army of the Cumberland from annihilation, preserved the Union's hold on Tennessee, and earned him a name that would echo through the ages, the Rock of Chickamauga. When dawn broke on September 21st, 1863, the fields and woods around Chickamauga lay silent, except for the groans of the wounded. The Confederates held the ground, but it was a victory steeped in exhaustion. The scale of the slaughter was staggering: nearly 34,000 men killed, wounded, or missing, the highest toll of any battle fought west of the Appalachians. Chickamauga had been a field of triumph for no one. Bragg's army had taken more than 8,000 Union prisoners, captured 40 artillery pieces, and scattered the Army of the Cumberland from the battlefield. But the victory was incomplete. The Federals were battered, not broken. Instead of annihilating them, Bragg halted his pursuit, content to occupy the ground his men had paid so dearly to take. His troops were starving, his horses worn out, and his generals already quarreling before the smoke had cleared. The same bitterness that had crippled his army before the battle now returned with a vengeance. Within days, the Confederate High Command descended into open recrimination. Leonidas Polk accused Bragg of failing to capitalize on success. Bragg accused Polk of disobedience, D.H. Hill denounced the entire operation as a blunder won by courage. Even Longstreet, fresh from Virginia, wrote to Richmond describing Bragg as unfit for command. "There is not an officer in this army who has confidence in him," he reported. Bragg retaliated by filing charges, suspending subordinates, and sending blistering letters to Jefferson Davis defending his actions. It was a victory poisoned from within. Meanwhile, the Army of the Cumberland limped north toward Chattanooga, its men trudging in rain and mud, numb with fatigue. They had left thousands of wounded behind in the fields and barns of North Georgia, where Confederate surgeons worked through the night under candlelight. Yet, despite the defeat, morale did not collapse. George Thomas's stand at Snodgrass Hill had given the men something to hold on to, proof that they had not been beaten by cowardice or lack of will, but by confusion and fate. By the time the Union Army reached the safety of Chattanooga's defenses, Rosecrans was a broken man. He could barely eat or sleep, consumed by guilt and disbelief. "We have met with a disaster," he wired Washington, "but not a disgrace." The government accepted the distinction barely. Within weeks, Lincoln would replace him with Ulysses S. Grant. For now, the battered Army of the Cumberland huddled behind its lines, cut off from supplies, hungry, and besieged by Bragg's victorious legions on the surrounding heights. And yet, in that moment of apparent Confederate triumph lay the seeds of defeat. Bragg had won the bloodiest battle of the Western War, but he had failed to destroy the enemy. The Union Army still lived, entrenched in Chattanooga, and the railroads of the South remained open targets. The Confederacy had no strength left to finish the job. Chickamauga would be remembered not as the South's great turning point, but as its last true victory, a triumph that, for want of unity and will, achieved nothing lasting. The rain returned before the army did. By early October of 1863, the battered remnants of the Army of the Cumberland were penned inside Chattanooga, cold, hungry, and encircled. Confederate artillery glimmered on the ridges above the city, cutting every road and river crossing. Braxton Bragg's army had turned its incomplete victory into a siege. From Missionary Ridge and Lookout Mountain, his pickets could see the Union camps below, their fires flickering weakly in the mist. Starvation was doing what bullets could not. For Abraham Lincoln, the news from Tennessee was devastating. The victory at Vicksburg, the draw at Gettysburg, all of it seemed to hang in the balance. If Chattanooga fell, the door to the Deep South would slam shut again, and the hard-won gains of the summer would vanish. The loss of Chattanooga, Lincoln said grimly, would be the loss of the key to the South. He needed a savior, a general who could do what others could not. And so he turned to Ulysses S. Grant. Grant arrived in Chattanooga in late October, silent and limping from a fall on the way. What he saw was worse than the reports. Rosecrans had been relieved, the army was near collapse, and men were eating their horses to survive. The Tennessee River, swollen and cold, separated them from their supply depots, and Bragg's army sat astride every route of approach. But Grant saw what others missed, a narrow opening through the mountains and the river bend west of town. If he could seize it, he could feed his army again. In a series of audacious night operations, Union troops floated down the Tennessee on pontoons, seized Brown's Ferry, and opened a tenuous lifeline from Bridgeport, a route the soldiers dubbed the Cracker Line. Within days, bread, coffee, and ammunition were flowing again. "God bless the Cracker Line," one private wrote in his diary, "for it has saved us from death." The siege was broken not by battle, but by ingenuity and nerve. Bragg's ring had been pierced. But Grant wasn't finished. Reinforcements poured in Hooker from the east, Sherman from the Mississippi, and within weeks, the Union Army had swelled to over 60,000 men. On November 24th, they struck. Hooker's troops stormed Lookout Mountain, fighting literally above the clouds. The next day, the combined Union force swept up Missionary Ridge, shattering Bragg's army in one of the most dramatic routes of the war. The same heights that had imprisoned the Union Army now became the stage of its redemption. When the smoke cleared, the Confederates were in full retreat, abandoning Tennessee for good. Chickamauga's bloody triumph had evaporated in less than 2 months. The gateway to the Deep South now lay open to Union armies, and from it Grant would launch the campaigns that ended the war. The Confederacy had won a battle and lost the West. History, though, has a cruel sense of memory. Chickamauga, despite its horror, faded quickly from the public mind. It lacked the clean narrative of victory, the simplicity of glory or redemption. For the North, it was a painful prelude to triumph. For the South, a reminder of a victory that accomplished nothing. Yet its legacy endures in the lesson that even the darkest defeat can set the stage for salvation, and that sometimes, in the long march of history, endurance matters more than triumph. Chickamauga's fields still whisper that truth beneath the pines, where the river of death once ran red and a nation learned how to rise again.